let me know when you're recording. I see we're recording now. And also, John, if I'm able to share screen, am I able to do that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and do this. And probably, very likely, okay, do you guys see the Epic Archaeology logo?
Yes.
Everybody see that? Okay, cool. So tonight, what I wanted to sort of touch on is, let me go back before I get to the first slide here. Something that you don't often hear a lot about in historical apologetics and in archaeology, because it's a fairly difficult subject to really bring down to earth into everyday language. We were talking about earlier about talking about translating scholarship into everyday language for people. And this is what I'm talking about is the earliest chapters of Genesis and the beginning of the historical record. So obviously tonight we were slated to talk about Old Testament archaeology. So what I thought we would do tonight is take a look at the first chapters of Genesis in a period of history, or really it's technically called prehistory, called the primeval period. And what I mean by that is that, yes, we have the Old Testament, we've got the book of Genesis written by Moses, but according to most conservative scholars, including myself, we believe that Moses very likely penned or wrote down the first 5 books in about the 15th century BC. So we're talking about the 1400s BC, which it is a long time ago, but from a historical standpoint, there's a whole lot of time before Moses wrote it down. In fact, so primeval history goes back to the very, very beginning of creation, the very beginning of time. And obviously Moses was not there, so either he got the information through direct revelation from God, or he got it through oral resources that he had available to him at the time. And there could have also been historical sources. We don't know. There's one scholar who is a British Assyriologist named D.J. Wiseman, who proposes a theory of the earliest chapters of Genesis called the Toledot formula. It's the Hebrew word Toledot, literally means this is the account of. So when you read the Hebrew account, this is the account of the heavens and the earth. This is the account of, where it says this is the generations of. That's how it's translated. But the Hebrew phrase is Toledot, T-O-L-E-D-O-T, Toledot. And so Wiseman proposes that the Toledot was actually potentially, it could have been cuneiform tablets or some form of record. But we just don't, right now, there is just no evidence. It's a hypothesized source. Whatever the case is, Moses is writing in about the 15th century. So what I want to do is I want to go back and ask a really important fundamental question. If this was a course in Old Testament archaeology, we'd have to begin obviously at the beginning, duh, and that would be in the book of Genesis, and that would be at the very beginning of time. So before we get into it, let me just give a couple of words of preface as we start to get into it. I want to ask you to reserve judgment until you hear some of the things I have to say, because I'm going to say some things that are fairly controversial depending on who you ask. But among Christians, especially people who are really into apologetics, and who study this issue, people have very strong opinions and views on some of what I'm about to talk about. So what I'd like to ask you to do is just consider what I'm saying and listen carefully to what I'm going to say and how I phrase things, just as something to consider. So what I'm talking about is the age of the earth, and then whether or not there was a flood. So the question is, where does the archaeological record begin? Because archaeology is a study of the past by primarily looking at artifacts. And an artifact is anything that's been made or modified by a human. Now, on the screen there, you can see the Epic Archaeology logo, and which is a pot, which is really the symbol of all archaeology, because we date sites primarily by using pottery, and that method of dating a particular strata in the archaeological record was developed over 100 years ago by a British archaeologist by the name of William Matthews Flinders Petrie, who was one of the founding fathers of American, or actually not American, but biblical archaeology. He actually learned how to use pottery to date sites by a German archaeologist by the name of Heinrich Schliemann. And Schliemann was excavating in the ancient site of Troy, which is the historical kernel of truth to the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But so you notice there on the pot symbol, there's a little handle, and here is a actual piece of pottery from not that pot, obviously. This is a picture, but one of the things we look for in archaeology is we look for artifacts. And so the question is, when we're looking at the earliest chapters of Genesis, where does the archaeological record begin? Where do we search? Where do we begin to see humans and their artifacts in the historical record? This question then hinges on the question of another big question, which it's going to really bring us into the talk tonight, and that is this: the flood. Was there an actual flood? Was it global or was it local? Was it a local flood that was sort of centered in Mesopotamia, or was it a worldwide catastrophic flood? Now, let me just say, again, I said earlier that I'm going to say some things that you might not agree with, and that's okay. That's fine. I'm not here to debate or anything, but I just want you to consider some things. And let me just say also, before we get into some of the evidence I'm going to present, that my views are a little bit, trying to think of how to word this. I'm not going to make anybody happy. The old Earth creationists are going to be mad at me, and the young Earth creationists are going to be mad at me, but I don't really care. What I care about is the truth. What I care about is what really happened. I don't care about anybody's theories. What I care about is I want to get at the truth. And I think one of the problems among Christians and creationists, and whether you're old Earth or young Earth, is sometimes we get narrow-minded so much to where we have our theory and we have to look at everything according to our theory. So the question is, was there a global flood? Now, let me say that I am not committed to an age and any. Now, I will say that I think the Earth is fairly young, and there was a global flood. So I'll hold to a global flood, but a fairly old Earth. The Earth has been around for a long time, seems like. There's some good evidence geologically of this. Now, it could be young. It could be young. I think one of the dangers is planting our flag in a date and say it's got to happen at this date. I think that's really dangerous, because the further we go back in time, the more cloudy things become. And then it becomes a question not of archaeology, it becomes a question of geology. So the methods that we would use to study this question are out of the realm of archaeology. They're into geology, they're into physics, they're into astronomy, they're into a lot of other things. So the question of where does the archaeological record begin brings in a whole lot of other issues that we have to deal with. So the first thing, though, but I think the fundamental thing is, because if there was a global flood, then that's going to affect where the archaeological record begins. We do know that in the earliest records that we have of human writing, and this is a fact, this is not controversial what I'm about to say, but the very earliest records that we have of human writing, the very earliest things, people are talking about a great flood. I mean, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the myth of Atrahasis, to you name it, there are all kinds of Sumerian, Babylonian. You go everywhere, and most cultures around the world have a myth of a flood. But the earliest accounts and the earliest writings that we have of literature are a recording of an event of the Great Flood. And so we know that this is a fact. So there are local flood arguments and there are global flood arguments. And let me just say, I've been involved looking at this back and forth. I've been back and forth on this question so many times. But let me just say, just from my own personal study on this, both views, both the local flood view as well as the global flood view, both have their issues. They both have strengths. They both have really good points in their arguments, and they both have weaknesses. Let me just point out a couple of quick things. And again, we're kind of flying through this as a survey, but let me just say a couple of things. On the weaknesses, I would call these anomalies. An anomaly is something that doesn't quite fit what the theory says. So in other words, if there was a local flood, then what data point would then argue against that? That would be an anomaly. And I would basically categorize these anomalies into two categories. Number one, it would be a scientific anomaly. And number two, a scriptural or hermeneutical anomaly. In other words, things that hermeneutically just doesn't make sense. When you read the biblical account of the flood, there doesn't seem to be any kind of metaphor. It seems to be pretty straightforward narrative. I mean, the biblical writers, Moses is talking about a real event. But then also there are some anomalies scientifically that we see in the scientific record. So with the local flood arguments, I would say that one of the weaknesses, and again, I know I'm simplifying this and I'm maybe overgeneralizing this, but we really just I wanted to move forward, but just to show you that one of the weaknesses are the hermeneutical arguments, because from a textual standpoint, the text seems to be pretty clear that the writers are talking about a real event. In fact, even in the New Testament, Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So he's quoting, he believes that it was a real event. Now, some people might argue, well, it was a local event. Yeah, that could be possibly the case. And so there's strengths and weaknesses on both sides. With the local flood argument, one of the best proponents today is our two geologists, Ryan and Pittman, who have proposed a Black Sea flood. This happened toward the end of the last ice age. Most of Europe and most of the world was covered in ice, and there was a glacial ice dam that burst and flooded over into it basically spilled a lot of fresh water into the Mediterranean. And then that water then overflowed the banks and went into the Black Sea and flooded the seacoast of the Black Sea. So that would be a pretty good local argument. But I guess the problem would be that when you begin to look at the biblical account, why didn't God just tell Moses to go, migrate? There's a big flood coming. You need to go south as fast as you can, because again, according to the text, he preached and prepared for the flood for a couple of 100 years at least. So it just doesn't. That's one of the anomalies. The other thing too is there's just no other, aside from the Ryan and Pittman flood theory of the Black Sea flood, there's just really no other archaeological evidence of any kind of massive flood in Mesopotamia. There's just not. So anyway, and then the global flood arguments are there's some strengths and weaknesses. So I want to go over some of the global flood. Again, I hold to a global flood, but it could be much older than we think it might be. So before we get into it, though, let me give you some dates from the scholars today, most Near Eastern scholars today, as they look at what's called Mesopotamian periodization. This is conventional dating. These are dates that secular scholars would agree with. And by the way, and I'll flying through this, and I'm talking fast, but let me just define what Mesopotamia is for those of you who may not know what that word means. Mesopotamia literally means land between the rivers. And the rivers that I'm talking about are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that roughly parallel modern-day Iraq. So if you look at Iraq today, the Tigris and Euphrates run northwest to southeast, and they empty out into the Persian Gulf today. Right at the waters where they empty out into the Persian Gulf, there are the oldest cities in the world. So these are the dates according to conventional dating. We have the lower Paleolithic, the middle, the upper, and you can see the dates there. The oldest dates are 300,000 to 80,000 BC. The Mesolithic and Epipaleolithic, 12,000 to 9,000. Then we have, beginning in around 9,000 BC, we see that pottery, let me back up and talk about the Paleolithic. This is called the Ancient Stone Age. So this would be when humans are primarily living in caves and using stone tools. So Paleolithic, paleo meaning Stone Age, so they're very crude stone tools. We see this archaeologically. You can kind of trace this. The Mesolithic this is sort of the beginnings of the pottery. So you have the pre-pottery Neolithic A, and you have the pre-pottery Neolithic B. And interestingly, there is a site in Israel. There's a lot of these interesting sites, these pre-pottery Neolithic sites. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Jericho, actually, the Jericho that Joshua and the Israelites marched around, the earliest layers of Jericho actually date back to the pre-pottery Neolithic. And what the scholars discovered there at Jericho was very interesting, some really bizarre artifacts. One of the things that's really strange is they found these human skulls that are real human skulls, and they're actually covered in clay. So whoever had them put clay back on the head of the skull, and they put shells in the eyes, and they buried these heads under the floors of their houses. Isn't that weird? I mean, that's just bizarre. I have a theory about that. You guys want to hear my harebrained theory about that? Okay. Nowhere, and I've read a lot on this, and I don't know, I've never read anybody that's had any kind of theory about why. They just state that they do it. Well, they say that they're revering their ancestors, whatever. What I think is that this is a memory of people that died in the flood. In other words, the people who were living in the Neolithic, the way to honor the ones that have died and went on. Now, these are people who survived the flood, the Paleolithic. And by the way, if I haven't stated it yet, let me just go ahead and let the cat out of the bag and let you know that what I believe is happening is that the Paleolithic, beginning of the Stone Age, is the period right after the flood. And the flood was global, catastrophic, wiped out the entire face of the earth, and that humans had to basically start all over again. And so they're living in caves. The surface of the earth is completely decimated. And so they had to basically live in caves. So by the time we come to the pre-pottery Neolithic, humans are revering their dead by burying them under their roofs of their houses. And really, if you think about it, if again, this is a big if there was a flood, then most of the people who lived before the flood are under their feet. So they sort of are walking on this sacred land. And so maybe in their own way, this is a way to honor their dead. It's just a thought. I have no way to back that up, but what do you guys think? Am I crazy? But nobody really knows why, but you can look this up. Just look at Jericho skulls. Just Google Jericho skulls and you'll see what I'm talking about. I need to actually have a picture of this. So let's move forward, and then one of the most as you're going to see here, as we get closer to the modern period. Now, it's not close relatively speaking, but 6,000 BC is a long time ago. But archaeologically, one of the very first periods that we are really able to trace archaeologically is something called the Ubaid period that dates to about 6,000 to 4,000 BC. Ubaid, and which is a site in Mesopotamia. The next period is called the Uruk period. This is really interesting, and it's subdivided into three different periods: the early, the middle, and the late. It is in the late Uruk that I believe the Tower of Babel is located historically. This is something that we can trace archaeologically. We're going to get to this in a minute, but I'm going to just go ahead and let you know that it's known as, in the archaeological literature, it's known as the Uruk expansion. So from the ancient site of Uruk, it's actually not Uruk. The Uruk is where it gets the pottery gets its name, but the site is Eridu, which is very close to it. But this is when history begins. So this is when we first begin to see pictographic writing, and people in Mesopotamia are on these little clay tablets, sort of like about the size of an iPhone or a phone. They can hold in your hand. They're actually making inscriptions on these tablets, and they're using little dots and dashes to record crops and things like that. So history begins in the late Uruk expansion, and I'm going to elaborate on this here in just a moment. But so if that is the case, if that is truly the case, and it seems to be the case historically speaking, then we have a long period of time between the flood and the earliest historical writings that we have. So, I mean, there could be writing before that, but we just don't have any evidence of it. I mean, we know archaeologically that people created great art. We can see the cave paintings that date to the Neolithic in France, and I think maybe there's some in Germany, but we see cave paintings. We see some other really remarkable things that humans were doing, but we don't really have any symbolic or any kind of writing in any form. The earliest writing that we actually have shows up in Mesopotamia, in southern Mesopotamia, at a site called Uruk. So that lets us. So again, this is just an educated guess, but for the earliest period of human history, humans very likely it was an oral tradition. They were orally remembering things, and we know. In fact, all the historical evidence seems to point to that as well. That before things were written down, there was a very strong oral tradition that would have been carried over from generation to generation. And that's really difficult for us to think about as moderns because everything is on our phone. It's I barely remember my own phone number. Because I don't have to. But back then, they didn't have writing. There was no such thing as a computer. So if you had a story or something that you wanted to remember, you actually had to remember it. And there was actually quite a lot that humans can memorize a whole lot. And so anyway, I thought that was really cool. We'll come back to this in a moment. Then we move forward to the Gemdit Nasser period as we get closer into the period, early dynastic period. And in the early dynastic period, we also have that broken down into three phases, 1, 2, and 3, and 3B, called the early Akkadian. In the early Akkadian is where we find Sargon the Great, or Sargon the First, whose regnal dates date from 2320 to 2265 BC. I believe, along with some of my colleagues in archaeology, that Sargon is actually the biblical Nimrod. When you compare Nimrod in the book of Genesis with Sargon, their two functions and their roles actually match very, very well. Nimrod, as well as Sargon, were the first empire builders in history. Sargon, we know from historical records, united the Sumerian and Akkadian-speaking people. So this would have been after the God confusing the languages, because before Babel, people could speak one language, and now with Nimrod / Sargon, and Nimrod, by the way, may not have likely been his real name, or not even Sargon, but again, there's good. I don't have time to get into it, but there's really good historical and archaeological evidence that points to Sargon the Great as being the biblical person of Nimrod. But anyway, he united the people that spoke different languages. He united them and was the first empire builder in history. So pretty cool. And a couple other kings in the early Akkadian period. There's actually, I think I have a picture I'll show you in a minute. But the next period is something called the Ur-3 period. And this is approximately when Abraham would have lived. Now, among evangelical scholars today, there are a couple of different dates that scholars look at for Abraham's life. And one of them is a later date, and the other one is an earlier date. Again, the date that I hold to for Abraham are the earlier dates, and I think I have a slide for this here in a minute. You're going to see Abraham's life on a chart. But Abraham would have been born approximately 2166 BC, and he would have entered Canaan right at the time of Ur-Nammu, who was the first king of the Ur-3 period, and was a great reformer. He was sort of like Ur-Nammu was, if you know your history, he was sort of like a Charlemagne, or a great reformer. I mean, there were a group of marauding people groups called the Gutians, 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 and they basically settled into Sumer, or Mesopotamia, and they were not very well developed culturally, and they were sort of, for lack of a better term, they were barbarians. They were from the north. They were from an area near the Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iran, and they came down into modern-day Iraq, or ancient Mesopotamia, and they basically sort of wreaked havoc on the land. And Ur-Nammu drove them out, and then began to rebuild Mesopotamia into its former glory. And there are a couple of things archaeologically that we see from his reign. He built ziggurats, pyramids, these stepped pyramids. He also instituted a law code that predates the Code of Hammurabi by centuries. And it's, in fact, most scholars believe that the Code of Hammurabi is based loosely on the Code of Ur-Nammu. These would have been laws as people began to live in cities and live close together. and they had these relationships, these economic and cultural relationships, there had to have been laws to sort of keep people, government, for lack of a better term, to keep people to do what they're supposed to do. So the Code of Ornamu is one of the earliest law codes in history that we see. Then we have Shulgi or Shulgi, Amarsin, Shusen, and Ibisen. Okay, so let's talk about some of the evidence for what I believe the global flood is. If there was a global flood, and what evidence would we expect to find? Now, again, let me just say, to just kind of bracket your, don't think, again, no offense to anyone, but don't think Ken Ham, don't think Creation Museum. Just think for a minute, the Earth is an open system. It is open to meteorites. Oh, actually, last night I had my. Yes, I'm a nerd. I have a telescope. I have not a very powerful telescope, but I've got a small Newtonian telescope. And we had a really pretty moon last night. And I had my telescope outside, and I was looking at the moon. And I mean, that whole surface of the moon is just absolutely pockmarked and riddled with meteorite impacts, with craters all around the moon. And the Earth is also impacted by meteorites as well. So we know that the Earth has underwent tremendous cataclysms in its history. So it's not crazy to think about some major cataclysmic event that happened in the earliest histories of the Earth. In fact, we see this all around the world. We see meteorite impact zones in Arizona. Of course, we've got, Crater National Monument. In South America, there in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a very famous impact crater area that's now underwater. It's called the Chicxulub crater. They're literally found around the world. So basically what I'm saying is that it's not too far-fetched. It's very plausible from just a scientific standpoint. Even if you didn't know the Bible or know the story of the flood, it's very plausible that the Earth could have undergone some giant cataclysm in the earliest histories of its existence. So was it a local or was it a global flood? Again, there are strengths and weaknesses, but to me, one of the biggest strengths of the global flood theory is essentially what's called catastrophic plate tectonics. So I know it's a big word, but let me explain. So basically before we get to the catastrophic part, let me just talk about what plate tectonics are. Go back on the picture of the Earth. So basically, plate tectonics is the theory, a geological theory, that the entire crust of the outer Earth is like, imagine an orange or a tangerine, and you peel the layers off. Well, the whole surface of the Earth is covered in this layer of outer crust or mantle, and it's very thin. The most of the Earth is under the surface. And so we know that the land masses that are above water have changed through history. And so basically, we believe that the land masses are moving away. And there's evidence of this. In fact, there's also evidence that the land masses were all together at one time that scientists call Pangea. You probably heard that term before. But what the difference is in the catastrophic plate tectonics is it basically takes the exact same theories that modern geology holds to. So it's not like out of the ordinary. It just speeds it up, and it says that it happened. So that some of the features that we see can't be explained by processes that are operating today. There must have been some event that made them really, really much faster than we would think, and so that's what we're going to talk about now. So that's what plate tectonics is. Catastrophic plate tectonics are basically that the plate tectonics did happen, but it happened very rapidly. And these, we can see these in another big word called cracktonic megasequences. What in the world is that? It's a very large lithostratigraphic sequence. Lithostratigraphic just simply means the rock layers, these rock layers. So a very large rock layer sequence that basically is a complete marine transgressive recessive cycle, a craton known as a megasequence, also a stratigraphic sequence or a SLA sequence or the super sequence or simply sequences. But basically it's these layers of rock that we see around the world, and there are many of them. We also see evidence of sea level rising and then falling, depositing these layers around the entire world. So these layers we're talking about, there are actually 6 of them, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly. There are 6 of these sequences. And so if there was a massive flood, then what you would expect to find is sediment around the world that is found in every continent. And that's exactly what we actually find. And the sequences are pretty remarkable. And the Grand Canyon, what's interesting about that, and a lot of people misunderstand the whole significance of the Grand Canyon as it relates to the flood. Let me clear some things up. What I think scientists are saying today, I mean, at least those who hold to a global flood, is that the canyon carving, in other words, when you go down and raft the Grand Canyon, that big giant hole in the earth was not necessarily a result of the drain off of the flood. It was the horizontal sequences that you can actually see. The carving, the vertical carving of the canyon was a post-flood event that dates back to around the time of the Ice Age. So we believe that there was, again, glaciers that were coming down from Canada, just like it happened in the possible Black Sea flood. As the glaciers were melting, a lot of this glacial water that erupted out of the land north of northern Arizona into northern Utah and Wyoming, it just basically flushed down into northern Arizona and carved out the Grand Canyon in a matter of days. But it's the horizontal sequences in the Grand Canyon that we see that argue for a massive flood event. And this is kind of a picture of it. So basically, when you go, if you were able to go to the Grand Canyon, there are only a couple of places around the world. In fact, I think the Grand Canyon is one of the few where you can actually see all 6 sequences in one location. And I had the really fun privilege of actually going to the Grand Canyon back in 2000. When was this? 2008. And I went through with some scientists and geologists. And our purpose was just to study the geology of the Grand Canyon. We also had an astronomer who worked for NASA JPL. That was really cool. And every night in the Grand Canyon, we'd actually have this astronomy lesson and geology. I was completely nerding out. Right? It was all, and then you're rafting in the Grand Canyon, it's awesome. But, one of the other things too about that, do you guys need to know who Del Tackett is? Del Tackett is Genesis History. He's the host of that. Del Tackett was on that trip as well. And Del and I got to be friends, and he's just a great guy. But anyway, so in this, in the very lowest layers of the rock, we have something called the Zoroastrian granite. And this is literally the bedrock of the North American continent. Everything above that was a laid down deposit. So if these horizontal deposits happened over millions of years of time, then you would expect to find chemical erosion between the layers of the strata. But that's not what we find. We find a lot of things that are not consistent with a long period of time. We see these sequences are laid down in fairly rapid succession. And not only that, there are massive, massive fossils that are found in these that are rapidly buried. And one of them in the layer is called the Coconino Sandstone. And we find, I think it's about 15 to 20,000 square miles. As far as we know, it could go further than that. You find these fossils called orthocone nautiloids. And they are literally, it's like a squid with a little pointed shell on the end of its little butt. And so imagine, what bugles look like when you eat a bugle, the little bags of, so these fossils look like little bugles, but a squid was in the shell. And what we see in the fossils are the little pointed shells. And we see these all throughout the Coconino Sandstone, and they're buried in a northwest-southeast position, which means that they were rapidly buried. This layer didn't happen like it wasn't just like a slow thing. That fossils in a very, very rapid thing. So anyway, that's just one of many things. And then so here are the actual names of these mega sequences. The earliest one is called the Sauk, and that's the earliest flood deposits, the Tippecanoe, the Kaskaskia, Absaroka, Zuni, and the Tejas. Again, the flood, if the biblical account is true and correct, historical and accurate, the flood was a year-long event. And so we've got the rising of the flood waters, and then you've got the receding of the flood waters. And so you've got to, so what happens is, to give you, again, I know I'm giving you a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. I realize that. But what happens is in a hurricane, you know, when you have a massive hurricane, like a Category 5 hurricane, what happens is you have the danger in hurricanes is you have what they call it, forgot title, not what's it called? Help me out, John. What's the, you know, one of the things that they warn about. Basically, when the waters, what happens is that a hurricane is like a giant vacuum cleaner, and it pulls the ocean up. Ocean surge, yeah, tidal surge. So what happens is it pulls a lot of sediment, sand up with it. And then once this hurricane hits the land, it deposits all that sand, and then it pulls back out once the water goes out. So if you've got this happening, and we see this when you can actually look at a cross-bedded sediment of a hurricane deposit, and it's called a cross-bed. So basically, you've got a layer of sand, and then you've got that the hurricane sediment then comes on top of that. It's floating, and all of a sudden, boom, it just rakes across it, and it cross-cuts that sediment. We see this in these sediments in a massive scale. So we're not talking about just like a hurricane, like a Category 5. We're talking about an event that is globally catastrophic. And that's exactly what the flood was. It was a global catastrophic event. So see, these mega sequences are quite remarkable, and I think just really can't be explained by this slow process. Here's an example of the Coconino in the pink. And again, we don't know how far it goes out. The Tepete sandstone. By the way, guys, these sediments are found across North America and America. And notice that on that yellow there, you guys are in West Virginia, but notice where the boundary of that Tepete sandstone is. What runs right along the edge of Tennessee up into North Carolina and Virginia and West Virginia? What geographical, what is there? You guys are right near it. The Blue Ridge Mountains, the Appalachians. And this sandstone is on the other side of it, which means that in the earliest history of North America and in the southeastern United States, in Appalachia, they also must have been fairly tall even then. So the sandstone stops there. We don't see it, and we see it come around. The other interesting thing, that you see that little jut right at the very bottom where it goes down into Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. Well, right there at that boundary of where Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia is, one of the largest cave systems in the world called TAG. In fact, it's an acronym, stands for Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. And we know in Kentucky that also just a little bit north of Tennessee into Kentucky, we've got Mammoth Cave system. So what I think is happening over here, again, is that the cave systems are actually part of the flood drain off. They are, as the floodwaters are receding off of North America and the Grand Canyon, after the Ice Age, they form, of course, this glacial cork, and then that thing burst, carves the Grand Canyon. In the southeastern United States, you've got the water going underground in certain locations, and in Kentucky, we've got it going underground and carving out Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and then in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, we've got this big cave system. Some geologists believe that the Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia cave system is connected to Mammoth Cave, and they're still mapping it today. They still don't know where it's. So that water had to go somewhere, and it went back underground and carved out these massive cave systems. This is it's 200,000 square miles at least, could be more. So again, that sandstone is one of those mega sequences that had to have been laid down first before it was carved through by the Grand Canyon. And you can see how large this is. This lithosome includes the Tepetes in the Grand Canyon. It goes all the way. So whatever did this was either a slow process or some event deposited this sediment across North America and Canada all the way up into Greenland, literally across the entire Canadian shield. So we're talking about massive stuff here. This is a National Geographic diagram of North America. That even by their own standards, most of the northeastern American geography was covered underwater at one time. So there are a few things here, expectations we'd expect to find if, in fact, there was a global flood. Fossil sea creatures high above sea level. Do we find that? Yes. We find that everywhere around the world. In fact, on Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world, we find fossilized ammonites, rapid burial and sedimentation of fossils. Absolutely find that around the world. Coal beds are a perfect example of this. They had to have been formed rapidly. Rapidly deposited sediment layers spread across vast geographical areas. We see that. Sediment transported long distances. We see that. Rapid or no erosion between strata. So again, if the Earth is old, and again, it could be old, but we're talking about the flood here and these layers that we see. The crust itself could be old. The Earth could have been here for a long time, and then the flood happened. But as far as these geological layers go, there's no there's no erosion between strata. These strata are laid down one on top of the other without any erosion in between them. And then they're also laid down in rapid succession. Here's an example I was sharing with you earlier about cross bedding. This is in the Grand Canyon. On the lower level, you can see the layers are sort of going diagonal. You can see there as they kind of go up to the left in the screen. And then the layer on top of it is literally just cuts right across it. And it's a massive layer. It's really, really big. In fact, if you were to stand there, this is probably 15 to 20 feet tall. That's how big this sand is. We're talking about a lot of sediment. This is my buddy. I put a big mustache on. His name is Ting Wang, and he is a professor of Greek at Golden Gate Seminary in California. And he would totally love this. He would love this. But anyway, I think I actually showed him this, and he loved it. But anyway, he's got his hand on this layer called the Great Unconformity. This is in between. This is found, by the way, around the world. This is not just, but it shows up in the Grand Canyon. So there is a layer called the Docks Formation, and it's right under something called the Depeat Sandstone. And in between the layers, there should be another layer of a billion years of time, a billion with a B, and it's not there. According to the standard model, there should be another layer of rock in between the docks and the Depeats, but it ain't there. So where did it go? Well, it never existed to begin with. And this is known as the Great Unconformity. One of the other things too that we see is folding in the lower layer of the rock. This is the folding in the Depeats, which means that when it was deposited, it was soft and pliable. And as the earth began to crumple and things like began to happen, shift around, there's folding in that area. This is going to be a little bit of a side note on geology and on some of the bias that we see scientifically among geologists against the notion of a global flood. This is a guy named Harlan Bretz, who was an American geologist working in the 1920s. And he had a project he was working on in eastern Washington state. And he was trying to explain the scablands of eastern Washington. Now, again, he's not a creationist. He's not a global flood proponent that we know of. He was an American geologist, simply trying to explain how the eastern scablands of Washington state could be explained geologically. Now, the 1920s, you remember, is when the Scopes monkey trial was going on, and there was a big debate about the teaching of evolution in American public schools. So the American public, as well as the scientific community, was really sensitive to this whole notion of creationism and that kind of thing. And so anyway, let me back up. Basically what Bretz proposed, I think I have a slide of this, is that the scablands of eastern Washington were carved out in a matter of days, not millions of years. Essentially, the scablands look like a miniature Grand Canyon. And what he proposed is that there was near Lake Missoula in Montana, there was we call it the Great Lake Missoula Flood. And again, an ice cork burst as the earth began to re-warm back up after the ice age. This huge, massive lake of fresh water burst open after the ice dam burst and flooded down into eastern Washington, carving out the canyon in a matter of days. This is what it looks like, 15,000 square miles, Palouse Falls. It looks like the Grand Canyon. And it's formed in a matter of days, not millions of years. Now, his theory was completely discounted by the scientific community because it sounded too much like he was trying to argue for the global flood. But what it ended up showing was a bias against this type of thinking, because Darwin's theory was based on a theory by Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, who believed that he was the father of modern day uniformitarian geology, which basically says the present is the key to the past. And that if you want to understand the present Earth and the way the Earth works and operates, you have to understand, if you want to understand the past, then understand the processes that work in the present. Well, yes and no. We know, again, to go back to the earlier slide of the Earth, remember that picture of the Earth I showed you? The Earth is open to being hit by things from space. And the Earth is open to getting cold and getting warm, and glaciers and ice ages and things like that. So it's a dynamic planet. And it's always changing. So it's not out of the ordinary that you could have something like this happen. But it was carved in a matter of 1 to 2 days, not millions of years. Eventually, he was actually vindicated. This is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, a former paleontology professor at Harvard University, who wrote in Natural History, which is not a Christian journal, The Great Scablands Debate. Brett stood against a firm, highly restrictive dogma that never made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the father of geologic gradualism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. And there's another quote. I don't think I have it. Yeah, it's not. Let me go back. And he says the establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition. Instead of testing Brett's flood in its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. And on the other slide that I don't have on here, basically he said that Charles Lyell, the geologist that he's referring to, won with rhetoric what he could not win with data. And that's interesting coming from Stephen Jay Gould, because he is a agnostic atheist professor at Harvard University, and basically said that and I don't know how familiar you guys are with Stephen Jay Gould, but his proposal was of evolution. He proposed a new theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium, because he recognized that there are major gaps in the fossil record. When you look at the fossil record of animals, you've got major animal body plans, and then there is a stop, and then there's another, and there's another. There's no gradualistic. So if Darwin was right, what you'd expect to find is animals evolving from very simple celled creatures to very complex creatures. And Gould basically says that's not what we see in the geological column. What we see is punctuated equilibrium. In other words, we see animals, then animals, then animals. There's periods of, he believed that evolution happened, but it happened in spurts. But that's got problems as well. But he at least recognized the fact that the geological record does not affirm the classical Darwinian model. So anyway, interesting thing here. And I'm not going to get into this, but let me, some people have asked me, could Noah's Ark have survived? That's all I want to do here is just answer that question with an archaeological example. One of the earliest archaeological discoveries that we find of a human being is called Otzi the Iceman. He dated from the Ice Age. He was discovered in the Italian Alps in Bolzano, Italy. He dates, and scholars go back and forth on this, and they're still debating about when he dates to, but they're pretty sure that Otzi dates to the Neolithic. And we have South American mummies, we have woolly mammoths. So yes, organic material can survive if it's locked in ice. And so cold, dry ice preserves organic material very well. In fact, Otzi actually has his own website. You can go Google it, OTZI. That's actually the little picture on the left is what Otzi very well may have looked like based on forensics scientist who reconstructed his body based on from the skulls and from the CAT scans. But it's quite remarkable what you can discover or what you can preserve with ice. And by the way, Otzi had tattoos, and they could actually get the stomach contents. He also had, I believe, a copper axe head, which blew the minds of the science. In the Stone Age, you're not supposed to have copper. But again, if he is a descendant of Noah and the people who survived the flood, think about this just for a second. If, again, just use your imagination, if that is true, if there really was a global flood and it wiped out everything on the face of the earth, humans had to start again. So whatever technology that they had before the flood, if they didn't take it on the ark, it would have been lost. So they had to start again. They had to start, and the earth got really, really cold because of all the events that happened for the flood. So there may have been some remnant understanding of metallurgy from before the flood, and certain smaller groups of people would have had that technology. So it does make sense that Otzi very likely could have had, I mean, he did have a copper axe head, which does comport very well with what we see in the biblical record. So anyway, check that out. This is from, I believe, I'm not sure who actually controls the website, but you just Google it, and it's in English and in Italian. And some cool pictures. Here's a cool picture of a woolly mammoth preserved from Siberia, very well preserved. They've just found another one recently. Actually, they found a cave bear recently, and the soft body parts are preserved very well. And a few years ago, there were some Chinese scientists who wanted to clone a woolly mammoth with an African elephant. And so it's, I guess, theoretically possible. We'll have to ask the biologist in the room. She might know. But hey, you could be a forensic archaeologist, anthropologist. You should do that.
It's a possibility.
Yes. See, Lauren, archaeology is a whole lot cooler than, finding out some disease or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. So again, we have ancient accounts of Great Flood. The earliest records that we have in Mesopotamia are people remembering a Great Flood. So again, I'm being very broad here, but what I believe is happening, to kind of paint a general scenario, is that the flood just wiped out everything, and the earth got really, really cold. Humans were hunter-gatherers for the first few centuries after the flood. They lived in caves. They tried to do the best they could. And then as the earth began to re-warm back up and the glaciers began to recede and form rivers, and animals began to repopulate the earth, we see in the archaeological record animal husbandry and agriculture, and then finally urbanism. So again, this is my understanding of the earliest archaeological period. The other view would be basically that humans evolved from simple celled creatures all the way up to the higher primates, and then some branches of those higher primates, such as the Australopithecine line, then evolved into Neanderthals, and then some other groups. But let me just say that in paleoanthropology, the study of early human fossils and evidence, there is not a consensus, even among anthropologists today, as to where humans came from. The only consensus they have is that they believe that humans evolved primarily in East Africa, in Tanzania, near Kenya. This is where they found some of the earliest supposed human missing link fossils, such as Lucy and some of the other Australopithecine fossils. But again, my counter answer to that would be that what people today say are missing links of humans and human fossils are actually extinct primates. They're not human. And even, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that let's just accept some of the fossils that they put forward. And let's say, okay, maybe there's something to these. And even the dates, let's accept even the dates. There was a study done years ago by a creation scientist, geologist, anthropologist rather, and he plugged in the dates of the supposed human evolutionary ancestors. And what he found is that there are anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens. So there are fossils of modern humans living at the same time as our supposed missing links. Again, using their own dates. One of them is, I think it's called the Kopsy skull, found in, it was either Israel or Jordan. And there are a couple other ones as well. I think it was a femur. but with paleoanthropology, there's a very big push to find evidence of human evolution. So they are under the gun to find evidence. That the narrative is that humans evolved from apes, so they have to find evidence of this. But they find these, like they'll find a bone, a rib bone or a leg bone, and they'll say, well, this is a missing. Well, there's no way to know, because context is important in archaeology and anthropology. Where you find something is important in connection to other artifacts. So anyway, so animals begin to repopulate, and then we have the first cities, and we have the first early dynastic period in Eridu. So any questions so far? I know that's a lot to a lot to digest. So I'll let you guys mull on that for a second, see if you have any questions.
Well, can I just get like a little bit of a clarification? I think I may be asking you for something that you've already said. I'm just trying to I'm trying to place you somewhere.
Okay.
I mean, I'm pretty familiar with old Earth, young Earth stuff, and obviously you're somewhere in the middle here. So I'm
Yeah.
just trying to figure out where.
Yes.
So, like a lot of your flood arguments, I mean, I've seen those verbatim, even down to some of the pictures used by some ICR guys. So, I'm familiar with the global flood arguments. And you've put some emphasis on where you think, like at the end of these mega sequences, that's where we could say the upper flood boundary is.
Yeah.
And it seems that the difference is, whereas a young Earth creationist could basically give that entire part of your presentation, they would just not put the dates with it. Like, you're willing to say wherever that mega sequence ends and whatever the traditional dating of it is, I'm willing to go with that. And young Earth creationists will argue at that point, start arguing with dating methods.
Yes.
But another prominent feature in young Earth discussions is not just the upper flood boundary, but the lower flood boundary. Do you have a strong position on that, like where we can look in the geological record and say, it looks like before this, that's not flood stuff, whereas above this is kind of flood all the way through the mega sequences to the very last one? Do you have a strong position on the lower boundary of it?
No, I don't actually. I'll tell you this is a sort of a side answer to your question, backdoor answer to your question.
Mhm.
Years ago, a few years ago, I listened to a lecture. I saw this lecture from a guy who is most definitely not a creationist, not a Christian. In fact, he's debated Stephen Meyer from the Discovery Institute, and his name is Dr. Peter Ward from the University of Washington. And he gave a lecture on the extinction of the dinosaurs. And I sort of was expecting to hear the typical, stuff that you would expect to hear from someone who doesn't believe in God. But as he explained it, I thought that's the flood. He's explaining the flood. And and even among again, I sort of straddle the fence on this issue. I think the crust of the earth could be here for a long time, but the flood is fairly recent. But I'm not dogmatic about it. I mean, I'm okay with 10,000 or 50,000 or whatever. I'm not dogmatic about those dates, but anyway, Peter Ward was explaining about the extinction of the dinosaurs, and he explained, and the evidence seems to be mounting on this, that there was a combination of factors that brought about the extinction of the dinosaurs. But what is very clear is that there's a layer around the Earth, everywhere around the Earth, called a KT boundary, the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. And I'm not exactly, this is what I'm not sure about, but I am sure that it does figure into this question. And that is, it's called the Chicxulub crater. So this is the crater impact I mentioned earlier that's found in South America. It would have caused, so let me go back to the KT boundary. The KT boundary is a layer of Earth's crust in which you've got dinosaurs, and all the fossils are found under that. So dinosaurs. And then above the Cretaceous, the Tertiary, above that, so closer to us, there are no dinosaurs, none. They don't exist in the after that boundary. Around that boundary is a layer of iridium, which is a radioactive isotope only found in volcanoes. It is also found in meteorites. So it could be very likely that when God broke up the fountains of the deep, he sent meteorites to hit the earth to crush up the crust and to send up water into the atmosphere. Who knows what else could have happened, volcanic downpouring. But just to give you an example, that an analogy would be like the tsunami that happened in Japan several years ago. If you've seen footage of that, it's just absolutely, that was a very small tsunami. If you can just multiply that times 10,000, we're talking about an event that Jerry Bruckheimer couldn't make up in a movie sequence. So we're talking about major cataclysm. And so I do place the KT boundary as an important boundary in the flood scenario, because we don't find dinosaurs after Cretaceous, but we find all the dinosaur fossils. I don't know of any that off the top of my head that are found in non-sedimentary rock. Every single one of these are found in massive flood sediments. So either there was a bunch of little floods that the dinosaurs ended up being in these little floods, or there was a major catastrophic flood that buried them in the sequences. In Utah, you have the Dinosaur National Monument. You have some other dinosaur fossils found out west that are jumbled together in the way that they're sorted. So this, I think, the KT boundary is an important boundary when you talk about the flood issues. But you're right. I'm not committed to necessarily a particular date, like 4,000, 5,000. It could be. But I think here's the problem in apologetics is that we just want to plant our flag in these dates and we just don't know. I mean, yes, we could use the biblical arguments, and I think there are some really strong cases for that. But I think you have to triangulate between faith and reason will ultimately match together. And I think we want to do good science, and we want to know what the text says. So I think that every one of us struggles to try to reconcile what we see in the scientific evidence with what we actually see in the text. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that was sort of my backdoor answer to your question. But no, I'm not committed to a lower flood boundary.
Yeah. And then another just like quick clarification. So when you were talking about the human remains, would you be more of a reasons to believe kind of model that Homo sapiens sapiens is what we're looking for when we're talking about, descendants of Adam and Eve? So you would take Neanderthal off the table, Denisovans off the table?
No, I don't. I actually agree with the young Earth people on that one.
Okay. So before, when you mentioned Lucy, you were talking about the ancestors, you're talking about Australopithecine.
Correct. That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah. In fact, I actually know Hugh Ross fairly well. I got to spend some time with him, and we were on the stage together several years ago at the National Apologetics Conference with. I was on with Bill Dembski, Hugh Ross, and who else was on there? Terry Mortensen from Answers in Genesis. It was interesting because Hugh and Bill Dembski ended up debating each other. It wasn't the younger people; it was the older guys that were arguing. But I actually have talked to Hugh about this, and I told him I disagree. In fact, not only Hugh but also Fuzz Rana about Neanderthal. In fact, there's good genetic evidence. You've got Neanderthal DNA in you. You got 4% Neanderthal DNA in you. So I do think that they are in the human line. They are a genetic sort of anomaly, but they're human. They're not non-human. And we don't know as we go further back in time. There's probably a lot of factors that we don't know about in genetics. But I'll tell you one of the things why I think Neanderthals were human. They buried their dead, and they had some kind of belief in the afterlife because they would put flowers and grave goods with their dead. We don't see animals doing that. Animals don't do that. Only humans do that. So beyond that, I think there's some good evidence that Neanderthals are human. Now, there are some people today who might act like Neanderthals. But anyway, I know we're running out of time here, but any other questions? Thank you for that question, by the way. Anybody else? All right. So let me just go over a couple other things here. Let me pause here and go. Let me see what I got, and we'll see what we got here. Let me But let me just, let me go back here and talk about one other quick thing here about this is tablet 11 from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was discovered back in the 19th century by Hormuz Rassam in Nineveh and translated by George Smith in the British Museum. Tablet 11 is the one that talks about the flood and Noah, but it doesn't say Noah. The Babylonian Noah was a guy by the name of Utnapishtim. What I think is interesting, again, to go back to what I said earlier, is that when humans finally do begin to write down their thoughts, the first thing they talk about is the flood. The very first thing they talk about. So I don't think you can just discount that. They're remembering something, and most scholars, even secular scholars, believe that these myths, supposed myths, in quotation marks, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the one that even predates it is the myth of Atrahasis, were based on earlier oral tradition. So even though these documents actually predate the Old Testament documents, even if you take a conservative date of the 15th century, Moses writing in the 1400s BC, these predate it by several centuries. So they're both drawing on some kind of oral tradition. The question is, what are the differences and what are the similarities between the biblical account in Genesis 6 through 10 and the Babylonian account? There are actually quite a lot of parallels, but there are some differences. And one of them is the dimensions of the ark itself that is given in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's the ark is presented as a large coracle, kufa or kufar. It was used in Mesopotamia in marshes and rivers. This would have been a large, round, sort of animal hide boat. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ark is presented as this gigantic kufa. And there was a scholar a few years ago who actually reconstructed a very, very large one, and it didn't do so hot. It floated down I believe it was either the Tigris or Euphrates. I'll have to find the video, but you can look it on YouTube. It was pretty cool, but the dimensions just don't really quite. It wasn't the most seaworthy thing that you could have ever built. But the dimensions of the ark, again, if you take this literally, are quite remarkable. It would have been 450 feet long, 45 feet high, 75 feet high, and 45 feet wide. Volumetric capacity at 1.5 million cubic meters, 56,000 cubic yards. A standard railroad car equals 2,670 cubic feet capacity. So this thing could carry a lot of stuff. 569 standard railroad cars was its volumetric capacity. Also, one other thing too that I don't have a slide for, and several years ago, one of the scientists, and you mentioned earlier, the Institute for Creation Research, the founder of ICR, Dr. Henry Morris, is a hydrologist, and they did a study, not him personally, but I think some of his colleagues did a study on, they built a scale replica of the biblical ark, and they put it in a tank where nautical engineers test super tankers for seaworthiness. And what they discovered, they put it through the motions, and what they discovered is that the ark, according to the biblical ark, could withstand a 200-foot tidal wave. We're talking about it would ride up on top. So, again, it's a circumstantial argument, but this is quite remarkable. You've got a document that's at least 3,400 years old. Again, if Moses wrote the Genesis account and it's recording these dimensions, they are quite different than dimensions of that. The other thing too, which to me is interesting about this whole dimensions of the ark, is why would God tell Noah to build this thing that could withstand a massive ocean tide, and it's just a local flood? It just doesn't quite seem to make sense to me why he would tell him to do that. Again, it's just my view on this. The other thing too is that the structure of the flood account in Genesis is different from a structural standpoint. It's in a polystrophe or a chiasm. It's a chiastic structure, which everything points to Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, God remembered Noah. So it's in this bookend. There's sort of a parallel. This is the way the Hebrew writers would try to emphasize things. They would do a parallelism. So there is a bookend, chapter 10a, and it goes all the way down. But everything points to chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah. Why is that important? Why? Let me ask you guys that. Why would that be important? Think about the context and think about the original audience. Again, Moses, where were the Israelites for 400 years? Where had they been for 400 years? Where? Egypt. Yes. They were in Egypt for 400 years. And what ancestor of the Israelites did God make a promise to? Who was that? Abraham. And God, in fact, I think there's a connection here in the flood account of God remembering Noah and God remembering the promise that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In fact, when Moses is before the burning bush in Exodus 3, and he says, you to go to the Israelites and you to get my people out of Egypt. And Moses says, when they ask me your name, what shall I tell them? And he says, I am, which is the first part. And then he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is my name forever. So God is connecting his name with the covenant that he made with Abraham. So God remembered Abraham, God remembered Noah, God didn't forget Noah. So again, a chiastic structure that points to God remembering what he said he was going to do. So pretty cool. The other thing that's cool about this is another early discovery, or at least a discovery that dates to the earliest periods of human history, is something called the Well-Blundell prism, or the Sumerian king list. And it alludes to the possible longevity of the pre-flood world. It begins with the mythical past. So I'm going to sort of summarize it as best I can. So basically, this prism lists a list of kings that reigned before the flood, and they reigned for 1,000 years, 1,500 years, and then the text says, and then the flood came and destroyed the entire earth. And then once the flood came, then kingship descended from the gods to men, and guess where that descended? It descended at Eridu, which is where the Tower of Babel is located. So the divine right to rule over the earth, and this sort of has a language like Genesis, where God told Adam and Eve to rule the earth and subdue it. So perhaps this notion of ruling the earth by God's authority, as it went through oral tradition, got corrupted into the gods gave men authority. So pretty cool stuff there. Again, I'm going to wrap this up here in just a second, but let me just talk about the Tower of Babel. The late Uruk expansion, where we believe the Tower of Babel. This is what Eridu looks like today. It's absolutely fascinating. This is in southeastern Iraq, and this was taken back in the, I believe, early 2000s, if my memory is correct. This is actually a photograph from the British Museum and the Iraq Antiquities Authority. And it looks like the surface of Mars. And this is the outline. You can see there that raised up little platform. That is the ziggurat at Eridu. And that ziggurat was built during the period of Ur-Nammu. This is the period that right after the time of Abraham. So we're talking about like the 3rd millennium BC. And another picture of that, what it looks like. This is what it looks like today. This actually was taken 2 years ago by a friend of mine who went to Iraq. He's an archaeologist at Yale University. His name is Matt Glassman. And Matt went to Eridu. I'm so jealous of him. I'm like, Matt, I hate you. But seriously though, guys, I mean, it's pretty, it's legit. It's like real Indiana Jones stuff. They had to have armed guards with them. It's a really Wild West area of southeastern Iraq. There were ISIS operatives in the area. But they happened to go during a sandstorm, and when he sent me these pictures, I was like, "Matt, this looks like the surface of Mars, man. This looks like something out of like Voyager spacecraft." But this is during a sandstorm, and this is the ruins of the oldest city in the world, guys. The oldest city in the world. The city of Eridu was built on virgin sand, and we read the biblical account that they came, Noah's descendants after the flood came to the place of Shinar on a plain, and they built a city. This city was built on virgin sand. There are no previous occupational layers of Eridu. This is what it looks like. And some of the artifacts that are lying on the ground are bricks from the time of Ur-Nammu. That's Matt there, trying to show off his muscles there. Matt's a great guy. He's a marathon runner as well. He's a good friend. But he literally in his hands has a brick from the time right after Abraham. Isn't that amazing? And it's literally lying on the surface. So when people think of here's I was telling you earlier, I was going to show you guys a slide from Abraham's time, just kind of give you a little context. Again, based on some of the chronology that I hold to with the Exodus and the patriarchs. Abraham would have been born in Mesopotamia in Ur at about 2166 BC. He enters Canaan about 2091, and you can see the dates there as we go on down. And then eventually in 1991, he dies at Hebron, and all the scriptural references are given there as well. So let me pause there because I want to talk about Babel, so I promised to do that. So when you think about the Tower of Babel, most people think about this kind of tower. This is a painting from Peter Bruegel the Elder that dates to 1563. And, when you think about a tower, you think about this sort of circular tower. And from what we know archaeologically, in the earliest layers of Mesopotamian history, it would not have been a circular tower. It would have been a ziggurat. So this is the great ziggurat of Ur. This was commissioned by Ur-Nammu, the guy that I was mentioning earlier, Ur-Nammu. And this is what it looks like today. You can actually go there today and see the ziggurat, the remains of the great ziggurat at Ur-Nammu. Now, going back to the Tower of Babel, what's interesting is that the tower itself, the name Tower of Babel, is actually not in the text. It just says God confused their language. So it was a tower, and Babel was an important part of that. The word Babel just means to confuse. So the best translation for that whole episode would be the Tower of Confusion. Now, what in the world? What's the big deal there? Why would God do this? Well, let me go back to the ziggurat. Where is it? Hang on. Lose my place there. Let's go back to the ziggurat. Again, I have a kind of a wild theory about this, about the ziggurat. Again, this would have been sometime after the flood. Not going to be dogmatic about that because we know that there was an ice age. We know that there was a stone age, and as the earth began to re-warm up. So this happened some years after the flood, but again, there was still a very strong cultural memory of the flood. And one of the interesting things in the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as in the myth of Atrahasis, is that both of the heroes of the story, in the case of the Epic of Gilgamesh, would have been Gilgamesh himself. He goes because his good friend Enkidu dies, killed by the gods. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh goes into mourning. He just is beside himself in mourning. So he wanted to learn the secret to eternal life. So in Tablet 11, he makes the journey to get this, guys, the great mountain where this man who survived the flood lived. And he goes in this mountain, and he talks to this man in the Epic of Gilgamesh. His name is Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim basically says, and there's a whole lot we could dig into with that, but basically he says the secret to eternal life is I'm really no different than you. The gods just decided to save me. But he says that there is a plant on the bottom of the ocean. Again, gee, I wonder what plant that would have been. There was a plant, a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the plant that gave him. So the plant, so he told him where to get it. So Gilgamesh goes to the bottom of the ocean. He gets the plant, and he sits on the side of the ocean, and a snake actually steals the plant. So he goes back to Uruk, and it's a sad story. The point is this, is that there's a memory of going on a mountain to get knowledge about eternal life, to get favor from the gods. Could it be that the earliest ziggurats were a memory of Mount Ararat and where the ark came to rest? Possibly. Again, let me just say that if you look at the literature of Assyriologists and people today working in Iraq, no one really knows the function of the ziggurat. They know that it served a religious function. They know that, but they don't know why. They don't know why they built these. Why a mountain? Why this sort of, maybe it was to be closer to the gods. Well, how could you get closer to the gods? Well, if you read your own literature, the way that they got close to the gods, they climbed a mountain and they talked to this man who had the supposed secret to eternal life. So the other thing too, in the biblical text, it says is that the text says that they wanted to make a name for themselves, which could indicate pride. It does indicate pride, in fact. And so it could be that that they had corrupted their understanding of God. So by God coming down to confound their language, he actually sort of saved them from further error and further confusion. So there's a little irony there that God confused them so that they wouldn't be confused about God. So anyway, that's where the Tower of Babel happens. And we see this in the city of Eridu. To go back to Eridu, we see in the earliest layers of Eridu, there is a ziggurat. The earliest layer of the ziggurat was abandoned. The first ziggurat before Ur-Nammu. There were several sequences of buildings before that, before Ur-Nammu came in the 3rd century or 3rd millennium BC. And that site becomes abandoned in the late Uruk. And we see that whoever lived there, they abandoned the site and they moved north, south, east, and west. So it's not just a matter of finding a ziggurat, it's finding a ziggurat where people left and moved out. And that's exactly what we find at Eridu. And it's well known in the archaeological literature. You can look it up. Look at late Uruk expansion. It's located primarily at Eridu. And we can see this in the archaeological record with the bevel rim bowls. We see large spouted jars. These are diagnostic artifacts that help us to identify the late Uruk expansion. We see this in northern Turkey. We see this in Egypt. The other thing too that they took with them is pictographic writing. And in Egypt, it develops into hieroglyphic. In Turkey, it develops into a Hittite language. So really cool stuff here, but direct archaeological evidence that the Tower of Babel really happened, and that it happened in the earliest city that was built by humans in southern Iraq. So I'll stop there. All right, I'll probably way over time here. So sorry about that, guys. But questions, comments, disagreements, debates? Everybody,
That
so
was
quiet.
super interesting. I feel like I learned so much.
Cool, very cool.
Yeah.
Had
really
you guys
cool.
ever heard any of that before? Have you heard it put that way before?
No.
A lot of this stuff is brand new to me. Like, I have so much stuff that I took a lot of notes that I have to look up after this and dig into more.
Cool.
Pretty
Well,
cool.
Yeah, I have. I've been thinking about this for a lot of years and trying to compile this together, and it just makes sense to me. Does it make sense to you guys? I mean, the evidence that I'm talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm careful with archaeology. In fact, this is more geology. But if as a historical apologist, as somebody who deals with archaeology all the time, I had to. What I'm trying to do in my ministry with Epic Archaeology is I'm trying to have, because eventually I'm going to publish all this in a book. So you'll have a book length. We'll begin with Genesis all the way through Revelation and talk about the historical and archaeological evidence for the scripture. And what I needed to do is I needed to have an accounting of the earliest chapters of the Bible. And there's no other way to me to reconcile that. Again, I think with both views of both the old earth guys are right on some things and the young earth guys are right on some things. But I don't think both groups are right on every single topic. I think they both are touching on some important truths, and I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. But again, both sides would probably label me as a heretic. Well, thank you guys so much for listening and not falling asleep.
Thank you so much.
For talking with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here. Very interesting.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And yeah, you seriously though, Lauren, and no kidding, or the rest of you guys, anybody can come in an archaeological dig, and a lot of archaeological digs now are multidisciplinary. So if you have a degree in biology or whatever, they actually seriously study micro artifacts, and we need biologists. We need people who understand. I mean, literally, we will get a dirt sample and we'll look at it under a microscope, and we'll find pollen and all kinds of things, micro artifacts. So you could volunteer as a volunteer at an archaeological site. Tentatively, right now, depending on how the whole COVID thing pans out, but I plan on being with my team in Israel next summer, digging at Shiloh, which is where the Israelites were located for about 400 years, as Joshua established that as the capital of Israel before David captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites. So we've been digging there now for about 3 years, and we had to cancel this year because of the whole COVID thing. But so pray for that, and if you guys would like to go, then I can share some information with John, and he can give it to you.
That'd actually be so cool. Yeah.
It's great.
I mean, I don't know if you probably wouldn't have any use for a lawyer, but yeah, but I'm totally down to go.
We have a use for a chicken farmer, though.
Oh, good.
There you go.
Great. Well, thanks, guys, and thank you for letting me be with you guys again. And I hope you enjoyed it. And maybe we'll have to do it again. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, we could get into David, the Davidic kingdom. There's a lot of archaeology, so maybe in the future, John, we can come back and talk about some more evidence.
Yeah, I mean, because we're always looking for guests, and they're really interested in what you talk about, obviously. As am I. It's just a little bit above my head.
Well, hopefully you can think about it later. It'll, connect. Well, thanks again, guys. I'm going to head out, and peace out.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you.
And now's when we all have our secret little talk.
Stop recording first.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.